Paul once remarked, "A lot of people said Michelle would have made a good single. There are songs that we like but wouldn't like to have out as singles. Because it's a very funny thing about putting a single out. We always used to think for a single, we'd have to do something pretty fast. I don't know why. They always sounded like the singles. So when we did Michelle, we all thought it was okay, but we just didn't want it out as representative of us at the time. Due to this mindset, the songs We Can Work It Out and Day Tripper were selected as the double-sided singles from these sessions in the UK. Meanwhile, Capitol Records in the US, always on the lookout for potential singles, chose Nowhere Man as their pick, which turned out to be a hit 3 months later. Unbeknownst to them, radio stations nationwide would heavily feature Michelle on their playlists. This came as a surprise, especially considering Rubber Soul was the first Beatles album without an obvious hit single. American listeners, intrigued by the album's content, found Michelle to be the most commercially viable track for radio play. Following the success of Paul's ballad Yesterday, which had topped the Billboard Hot 100 just a month before, Michelle was warmly embraced by the public. Although Michelle wasn't finished until shortly before it was recorded on November 3rd, 1965, its origins may be tracked back to the 50s. All my first songs were written on the Zenith, Paul remembers. Songs like Michelle and I Saw Her Standing There. It was on this guitar that I learned 20 Flight Rock, the song that later got me into the group The Quarrymen. There used to be a guy called Austin Mitchell who was one of John's tutors at art school, and he used to throw some pretty good all-night parties. You could maybe pull girls there, which was the main aim of every second. You could get drinks, which was another aim, and you could generally put yourself about a bit. I remember sitting around there, and my recollection is of a black turtleneck sweater and sitting very enigmatically in the corner playing this rather French tune. I used to pretend I could speak French because everyone wanted to be like Sacha Distel or Juliette Greco. So I used to sit around and murmur.
And the song Michelle, which was just really just me at parties, mainly at art school parties. John went to art school. And so me and George were like the young kids who were kind of, crashing the party. John would say, you can come along, all right? So we'd wear kind of a black roll neck sweater to try and look very French. And I'd often take the guitar and sit in the corner and thinking, some girl would go, wow.
This French guy.
Comment allez-vous? Oh, oui. But
never happened?
No. None of that ever happened. But years later, John did say, remember that crazy little French thing you had? He said, you should finish that. So I finished it.
You added Michelle at that point, or you were singing that
so
back when
there
you were
were no
to...
words. It was rendezvous.
At this time, Paul would just play the instrumental version of the song while adding a little vocalization during these get-togethers. It was a tune that I'd written in the Chet Atkins finger-pickin' style. There was a song he did called Trombone with a repetitive top line, and he played a bass line whilst playing a melody. This was an innovation for us. Even though classical guitarists had played it, no rock and roll guitarists had played it. Based on Chet Atkins' Trombone, I wanted to write something with a melody and a bass line in it, so I did. The other interesting point was there's a very jazzy chord in it. Michelle, my belle, that second chord. That was a chord that was used twice in the Beatles, once to end George's solo in Till There Was You, and again when I used it in this. It was a chord shown to us by a jazz guitarist called Jim Greddy, who worked behind the counter at Frank Hesse's, where we used to buy our instruments on the Never Never in Liverpool. So Jim Greddy showed us this one great ham-fisted jazz chord. Bloody hell! George and I learned it off of him. Paul's McCartney 3-2-1 series provided another source of inspiration. The other thing was, because I had the Frenchy thing in my mind, Edith Piaf did a record Milord. I was kind of going off the back of that.
Interesting, it was a big hit because it was out of left field. Whereas all the other songs you sort of knew what genre they were. This one was French. Mm-hmm. And had this interesting, no, 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 me lord. The idea of a girl sort of talking to a guy about me lord. We didn't quite get it, but it was nice. And then she slows down, dun, 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 me lord, does that trick.
Over the years, this instrumental was never given any real attention, but it was resuscitated since they realized they needed to write a lot more original music for Rubber Soul. Paul continues, John said, "Do you remember that French thing you used to do at Mitchell's parties?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, that's a good tune. You should do something with that." We were always looking for tunes, because we were making lots of albums by then, and every album you did needed 14 songs, and then there were singles in between, so you needed a lot of material. It was then that Paul's friendship with buddy Ivan Vaughn, who first introduced Paul to John in 1957, came in handy. Ivan's wife, Jan, was a French teacher and helped him a lot. I asked her what sort of things I could say that were French and which would go together well, Paul relates. It was because I'd always thought that song sounded French that I stuck with it. I can't speak French properly, so that's why I needed help in sorting out the actual words. John remembered. Going French was Paul's idea. Jan Vaughn remembers. He asked me if I could think of a French girl's name, with 2 syllables and then a description of the girl that would rhyme. He played me the rhythm on his guitar, and that's when I came up with Michelle ma belle, which wasn't actually that hard to think of. I think it was some days later that he called me up and asked if I could translate the phrase. These are words that go together well, and I told him that it would be sont les mots qui vont très bien ensemble. I got that off Jan, Paul remembered, and years later I sent her a check around. I thought I better had because she's virtually a co-writer on that. From there, I just pieced together the verses. This is where John comes in. As he explains, he and I were staying somewhere, and he walked in and hummed the first few bars with the words, and he says, "Where do I go from here?" I'd been listening to Nina Simone. I think it was I Put a Spell on You. There was a line in it that went, "I love you, I love you, I love you." That's what made me think of the middle 8 for Michelle. So my contribution to Paul's songs was always to add a little bluesy edge to them. Otherwise, Michelle is a straight ballad, right? He provides a lightness and optimism, while I could always go for the sadness, the discords, the bluesy notes. The Beatles got together at EMI Studio 2 on November 3rd, 1965, with around half of Rubber Soul finished, for a 9-hour recording session to finish recording the previously finished song Michelle. Paul states, "We had 1.5 hours to make that track, which is pretty economical." Out of all the songs on the album, only this one required more than 4 tracks available on the recording console. The first 4 tracks were filled with material from the initial session. Track 1 features the rhythm track, which consists of drums and acoustic guitars. Even though this rhythm track only required 1 take, a significant amount of practice was undoubtedly conducted beforehand to ensure that the arrangement was flawless. The rhythm track slows down at the end, which is typically thought to be a mistake. It slows down on that last part, Macca corrects, only because we thought it sounded better that way. It was our attempt to be like the Edith Piaf Milord record, where she slows, but we didn't dare do that. So we just sort of slowed down a little bit. It just sounds like we got it wrong. George Martin concurs. Paul asked for the music to be slowed on the last part of Michelle to add more emphasis to it. I think it achieves the desired effect.
Luckily, we came in prepared. We knew it all. So I played the guitar, did that. George made a lovely solo on electric guitar. And the rest of the guys sort of filled in. And then it came time for me to play the bass on it. And again, these little tricks that had sort of got loaded in my sort of consciousness, like all my life, just musical ideas that I'd heard that I could pull from my subconscious and sort of use them. What I like particularly on that is where the chords are descending in the C minor thing that it is now the verse thing. Until I do know, and you know, no. It goes boom, ching, boom, ching, boom, ching, boom, ching, boom, dum, dum. While that's happening, don't you, I go dum, 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 instead of kind of going boom, boom, or boom, boom, boom. So going with it, I go against it with the bass, which I was very satisfied with.
Paul's lead vocal was heard on track 2. The same harmony vocals from tracks 3 and 4 were double-tracked for a deeper, richer sound. Track 3 featured a set of 3-part harmonies from John, Paul, and George, orchestrated by George Martin. The final version of the song features 7 beautiful voices. You would think that we would have gotten together and worked out those harmonies. Of course, George Martin, our producer, was very helpful with that too. George would sort of say, "Okay, Paul, your line is," or whatever, and then he said, "Okay, George Harrison, yours is." They would be strange little lines that are unrelated. We just had to remember them or else the grown-up would tell you off. As was usually the case, the arrangements to Beatles songs, as well as additions to the actual songwriting, occurred during the recording sessions. The bass line for this was thought up on the spot, Paul remembers. I never would have played Michelle on bass until I had to record the bass line. Bass wasn't an instrument you sat around and sung to. I remember that opening 6-note phrase against the descending chords in Michelle was like a great moment in my life. I think I had enough musical experience after years of playing, so it was just in me. I realized I could do that. It's quite a well-known trick. I'm sure jazz players have done that. It was good when I found that. Looking back, I astound myself. The guitar solo in Michelle is my composition actually, George Martin said in 1993. I wrote down the notes and said, "I'll play this. George, you can do these notes with me on the guitar. We'll play in unison." Even though Michelle has a catchy melody and chord structure, closer inspection reveals certain oddities that might surprise us. Although it has typical verses, bridges, and solos, each element's measure count is considerably different from anything else in the Beatles' catalog to this day. A second unusuality for the ensemble is that the song is in the key of F. The only other member of the Beatles to use this key is Paul, who did it a few months prior on Yesterday, the year's first truly groundbreaking ballad, and Hold Me Tight. Paul's tendency to switch between major and minor keys is a common occurrence. The verses use F major as the main key, while the bridges are structured in F minor. When paired with a beautifully composed melody line, the straightforward lines have a Shakespearean quality. The charming lyrics relate the story of an English-speaking man who is terribly in love with a French-speaking woman, whom he calls Ma Belle, or My Beautiful. He might not have gone any further with the story than this, but he didn't have to. In the end, the listener is left wondering at the end of the song whether he ever really did find a way to get his point through.